My name is Daisy Gould. I'm the Assistant Curator of Live Programs here at Serpentine, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Annalee Davis. Annalee Davis is a Barbadian visual artist and writer whose practice combines history and biography in discussions of post-plantation economies with cultural activism in the arts sector. Davis's works explore Barbados's transformation from a once biodiverse landscape to sugar plantations and more recently a tourism-dependent island, both arguably sectors of enclosure and exclusion. Working in her studio located on an operational dairy farm, once a 17th century plantation, Davis exposes the polyvocal narratives buried beneath the land. Today's conversation will focus on her work with gardening and agriculture as a means of resistance and historical reclamation, both in the Caribbean and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Annalee Davis. Hi, Annalee. We're so happy that you're here and that you could join us today. I think to begin, your practice is deeply embedded in ecology and specifically land practices. And while your works engaging with agriculture and gardening have manifested in diverse locations, they remain deeply rooted in Caribbean ecology and discussions. In the interest of time, we've decided to discuss two works in particular today: A Garden of Hope in Barbados and Pray to Flowers, A Plot at Desalination, which you created for the 15th Sharjah Biennial last year. Could you perhaps share the origins and inspirations behind these two works?
Well, first of all, thank you, Daisy. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I think I should situate myself first. I am born and raised and living and working in Barbados, which is a small island in the southern Caribbean. I'm physically situated on this working dairy farm that was initially a sugar plantation from 1667 that was acquired by my great-grandmother in the 1920s. And my brother has been running it for the last 40 years and took it out of sugar and has transformed it into a dairy farm, and it's now going through a transition into an energy farm. What you're looking at here on that slide is an old mill and the old sugar works building from several hundred years ago. So my studio is just to the right of those. So I look onto these old structures, so it's impossible not to be aware of the history that runs through that particular location. My colonial education, which I'm sure those of you who were born and raised in Britain have been exposed to colonial curriculum as well, meant that we were very disconnected from a lot of what was happening on the ground beneath our feet. And so I was born on a sugar plantation, on a state-owned sugar plantation that my father ran. And yeah, it's a very complex kind of history, and I realize that my whole work, my life's work as an artist, is to unlearn the plantation. It sits deeply within me, and I think it sits deeply within all of us in the Caribbean. We were Britain's first sugar isle. It's where Britain used Barbados as a laboratory for developing the model of the plantation that ricocheted across the region. And it's where the 1661 slave code was written. So it really has shaped every aspect of who we are in terms of ecology and gender and race and notions of who belong and who don't, hierarchies. The British colonial project, when they entered in 1627, by the third quarter of the 17th century, almost the entire biodiversity of the island was wiped out. So I've been thinking about how to form a more intimate relationship with the landscape from which I felt distance, because it's been mediated by the plantation for 4 centuries. Part of that, I guess, unlearning was I walk a lot, so I would come across these supposedly wild plants growing on the hedgerows of sugarcane fields and former sugarcane fields, and I started collecting them and pressing them and photographing them and drawing them. And these drawings are on plantation ledger pages, which is the instrument of the British Empire that was used globally as an accounting system. It's what allowed for reparations to be understood because the British recorded everything so very well. And I felt that those ledger pages needed to have another kind of narrative or image inserted into them. And these wild plants that my father would have had removed from the furrows of sugarcane fields, either by hand or chemical, they actually had another story to tell that I didn't know anything about. There's a book by a Cuban writer, Antonio Benitez Rojo. It's The Repeating Island. And he's written about how Caribbean history is akin to a long annelid parasite that moves through the bowels of the region. And this, to me, has really stayed with me for a long time because it speaks about that extractivist nature of the plantation. And this is part of a series of drawings where I'm confronting these long annelid parasites. And then continuing to do drawings of plants that I come across as a way to know them, to recognize them, to learn about them, to understand their history. And I started working, this is the Scotland district of Barbados. It's named that because Scottish indentured labourer came to Barbados and they recognized in the landscape the highlands of Scotland. And this was a sugarcane plantation. Everything was. The entire island was a sugarcane plantation. And then it became a silica sand quarry, the only one on the island. And now it's being converted into the Caribbean's largest permaculture and conservation site. And I was given an opportunity to develop a garden here. It's called a Garden of Hope. And it's called a Garden of Hope because this former plantation was an amalgamation of several estates, one of which was called Hope Plantation, and it was owned by a woman, Judith Powery. And so I developed a Garden of Hope as a space to recognize plots that were in part of plantations. And this is particularly looking at local plants that have healing properties for women's reproductive and post-reproductive well-being. So these would have been used historically within enslaved society in Barbados. And then Pray to Flowers, a plot of disalienation. It's an attempt at becoming more connected to the land. This was for the Sharjah Biennial. And I worked very closely with an amazing Dutch artist, Yuri Guipin, who has his own seed bank of 600 species, and invited him to come with me to Sharjah in November of 2022. And we went in and we planted out about 100 different species, left them about 6 centimeters tall, wondering whether this whole thing would collapse. And when we came back in February, there was this beautiful proliferation of plants that had taken over the courtyard. Different to the one in Barbados, I included sugarcane and banana as a reference to the colonial plantation plants because I wanted them to be colonized by these healing plants. And then more recently, this small exhibition in Girona, Spain at the Iris Wang de Laffy Gallery was trying to grow a garden there with Barbadian seeds, but the weather, climatic conditions were so extreme that they were difficult to grow. And so this becomes a kind of a herbarium of those. And then I just wanted to say that in opening the garden in Barbados, I invited Irika Jelani, the woman with the shacks, who was a former student, is a PhD student at the moment, a basket maker, but an elder in the Spiritual Baptist Church, to bless the garden and to recognize the ground as hallowed.
Amazing, thank you. You mentioned the plot when you talked about a Garden of Hope, and I understand it's an important part of your ongoing work as well. For those who are unfamiliar, could you briefly explain the history of the plot and its significance within plantation economies and ecologies?
Yes. So the plot is written about by Sylvia Wynter, a Jamaican writer and philosopher, and she speaks about the plot as a pre-capitalist site located within the larger capitalist machinery of the plantation. And this is a very interesting idea because the plot was not observed as heavily by overseers as the rest of the plantation. These were marginal pieces of land called rablands that were maybe gravelly. They didn't have as good maybe topsoil. And these lands were given to enslaved people who, in addition to working on the plantation, also had to grow their own food as a way for the plantation to save money. But in addition to growing their food, these plots became emerging sites of care and community, and they brought the history from Africa with them that came into these plots. This is where bush tea, bush bath, bush medicines, where people could take care of each other within the plots and have retentions of practices that came with them from Africa. So they're really sites of resistance that were not looked at so carefully by the overseer, because the plantation also is the practical application of geometry, the very straight furrows of sugarcane fields that are very clearly delineated. And the plots had, maybe konoko is a term that some of you may know, this sort of intercropping. It had a different kind of placement within the plantation. And I think as sites of resistance and healing, there's a lot for us to learn about.
Yeah, I mean, your work really highlights the deep interconnection between Caribbean history and ecology. You and I, for instance, have talked about it within the context of Malcolm Ferdinand's book, Decolonial Ecology, as well. And you've talked a little bit about the significant or the specific role of ecology in collective resistance practices in the Caribbean, and I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that within your practice.
Yeah, Malcolm Ferdinand is a French Caribbean writer of this book, Decolonial Ecology, and it's been recently translated into English. And I was very struck by how he spoke about the fact that the Caribbean is one of the only places in the world without a motherland, which is such a tragic thought, that Asia, Africa, Eastern and Western Europe, North America, South America have motherlands, but we are what he calls a land without maman, which is such a disturbing thing to consider. And I think the patriarchal nature of the plantation is one that removed us from a relationship with the soil. And so I think, that has influenced my thinking around how do we reconnect and refoster these motherlands, and these plots in some way were these small motherlands or mother plots. In my own thinking about the plantation and the history of cartography, what you're seeing here is something called a walker's diary. And I'm using these pages that I found in an abandoned sugar factory that are from the lab, which would have made like these daily analysis records in the sugar production. And so rather than thinking about these as scientifically accurate and objective, I'm using them as a way to map my walking through these landscapes. So this walker's diary is really thinking about how to form this more intimate relationship with the land. So there are things that I find on my walks, and the maps are removed from the legend, so you can't see where these places are, but I know those lines and those contours. And so it's trying to learn how to read the landscape differently. And for example, in this image, it's my walk, the map of my walk, but then there are also these porcelain and clay shards and other objects in the soil, many of which come from England. So they were manufactured in Derbyshire and Staffordshire and came in as ballast on ships. And when I walk every day, these shards show up in the soil. They're just right under the soil. So there's this notion of soil being very alive and telling us stories, and we're able to read it in a particular way.
You've touched on ritual a little bit as well, and a few of the speakers prior have talked about the sacred in relation to the land as well, especially when it comes to directly engaging with the environment or engaging more deeply than forms of sort of legitimizing or colonial conversations can. Could you perhaps expand on how ritual informs your practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the studio is a sacred space. I think that the walking is a sacred act. These fields were not intended for walking in that way. They become these sort of meditative acts in the space as a way to try and, it's very difficult in Barbados to look at the landscape without seeing the plantation. And now it's being mediated by the tourism economy. So there are all of these levels of mediation that we have to sort of work our way through. And so I think that walking and being in the land and making work and connecting, recognizing seeds, wondering if I can know a land through how the wind moves through particular trees, and then working with Eureka when we did the blessing for that place. It's also drawing on Karen Armstrong's writing to recognize the sacrality of all things. And I come from a country that was, there were plantations and Anglican churches. And that taught us to have a dominion over rather than a relationship with. So in working with Eureka and beginning to understand more about these plots in enslaved society, it's this recognition that things are sacred, the ground is hallowed, and we need to take care of it in a very different way.
Absolutely. We've focused a lot on Caribbean ecologies, specifically talking about Barbados, but I think it's crucial to recognize how these local historical and systemic discussions actually transcend temporal and spatial boundaries and address more wider global ecological issues. And I think specifically in light of the contemporary context, thinking about Hurricane Beryl, which devastated whole countries in the Caribbean last week, what role do you see the plantation system play today when it comes to global climate breakdown and disaster?
Plays a big role. There's the term the Plantationocene, so different to the Anthropocene, which suggests that I think all humans are equal in the destruction of the earth. The Plantationocene puts capitalism in the driver's seat of the epochal shift. And so the plantation, I think, has contributed in terms of consumerism and greed and consumption and excess. So what has happened in the Caribbean, that way of thinking has expanded around the world. The garden that I did in Sharjah, just sort of dealing with these climatic shifts, was supposed to remain at the Sharjah Foundation for 3 years, but unfortunately in August of last year, an unusual storm came through the Arabian Gulf and demolished, prey to flowers, a plot of desalination, which was a very difficult thing to witness from afar. So I think we're seeing the impact of these climatic changes, not just in the region, but in other parts of the world. Interestingly, what ended up happening here was that the sugarcane is what survived. And this was a very brutal realization for me to swallow. But yeah, I guess it speaks to how embedded these systems are in our in the way that we live and work, and that we have to keep working against that.
I think I'm conscious of time, but to close, in A Garden of Hope, you ask, how can intimately knowing this haunted land render honest self-reflection as well as strength to resist the Plantationocene? And we often think of this space at the UK, and perhaps more specifically the context of today, Kensington Gardens, as being separate from the plantation, but it is intimately intertwined. So what do you think we can learn from intimately knowing this haunted land?
Well, I did a project for the National Trust for Scotland. They have a program called Facing Our Past, and I think that inquiry and curiosity can happen everywhere. I think when I worked for the National Trust for Scotland, I was surprised at the ignorance around their relationship to the Caribbean. And that Facing Our Past program was looking at properties that the National Trust owned that were funded by plantations in the Caribbean. So I think all of us have been educated in a colonial way, and that it's our job to unlearn the plantation within our own colonial structures. And I think reading against the grain of history and the work that you're doing here, obviously at the Serpentine, so that work can happen here as well. Yeah.
Amazing. I think on that note, Annalee, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you.